Okay, in this video we're going to look at Chapter 11, Disorders of White Blood Cells and Lymphoid Tissues. And we know that all of our blood cells originate from red marrow, and these actually start with a pluripotent stem cell, which we call the hemocytoblast. You find these hemocytoblasts within red marrow, and they can differentiate into two subtypes. We have a lymphoid stem cell and a myeloid stem cell. The lymphoid stem cell can differentiate into your lymphocytes, hence the name lymphoid stem cell. So this can give rise to your B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. And these are the ones that are more commonly associated with the lymphomas. Now, these pluripotent or hemocytoblast stem cells can also differentiate into a myeloid stem cell line, which gives rise to every other cell type within blood. So the myeloid stem cell line can give rise to the erythrocytes, the megakaryocytes, which produce platelets, as well as some of your granulocytes like your neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, and monocytes, which are circulating macrophages. Now, these myeloid stem cells are more associated with leukemias when they have out-of-control growth. So just to kind of summarize the functions and appearance of some of the more common leukocytes, remember we have our neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And their relative abundance in normal blood, we find that the neutrophils are the most abundant. These are the ones that are sort of the bacterial slayers. They're part of your first line of defense for lymphocytic function, and they help to engulf foreign bacteria and microorganisms. So they have some sort of phagocytic function. Now, the second most common are the lymphocytes. And so lymphocytes include your B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. But within your bloodstream, these are the second most common type of immune cell. Now, the B cells and T cells are part of your learned or adaptive immune response. And so these are actually going to be trained, or they're going to learn to fight off certain antigens that you're exposed to over the course of a lifetime. Now, the next most common leukocyte are the monocytes, which are circulating macrophages. So what these cells can do is essentially leave the bloodstream through diapedesis and margination, and then enter an infected tissue or a site of inflammation where they can help to engulf debris or foreign microorganisms. Now, the next most abundant is the eosinophil. And eosinophils, you can see, have lots of these granules within them. These are actually going to be involved with helping to fight off parasitic infections. And so you can find that eosinophil count can increase if someone's exposed to a parasite. And then the least most abundant are the basophils. And the basophils have a lot of histamine granules, and they have also slight phagocytic function. So remember, the neutrophils are the most abundant and the primary pathogen-fighting cells. Eosinophils help control allergic responses and also help fight off parasites. Basophils are blood cells that release heparin, histamine, and other inflammatory mediators. And then mast cells can release heparin, also involved with preventing blood clotting. Histamine, which is involved with the inflammatory response, and it's also involved with allergic reactions. So remember, the lymphocytes, which are the second most abundant leukocyte in your blood, include your B cells and T cells. B cells produce antibodies, and T cells include the T helper and cytotoxic T cells. Remember, the plasma B cells are the ones that produce antibodies, which can help to target specific antigens within your body. And then your T helper cells, which are CD4 positive, that's their MHC. We find that the CD4 positive T helper cells, they activate the immune response by helping to secrete inflammatory cytokines, which get other immune cells kind of excited and ready to fight off infection. So T helper cells can recognize foreign antigens, and then they release cytokines, which can activate B cells as well as cytotoxic T cells. Now, the cytotoxic T cells are CD8 receptors, and they help to basically kill foreign microorganisms directly. Now, the natural killer cells also kill antigenic cells, but these NK cells are part of your innate immune system, so it's not like a learned or adapted response. Now, the monocytes are circulating macrophages. They're antigen-presenting cells, because what they do is after they engulf a foreign antigen, which could be like on a microorganism, essentially what they could do is they actually can put this on their membranes and then present that to other immune cells, like the lymphocytes. Now, this question here asks, which type of leukocyte works the hardest when you receive a vaccination? So if you remember, vaccinations include antigens, and an antigen is going to be a specific molecule that's associated with a certain microorganism. And so what the question here is asking then is, in another way too, is which of these cells is part of your learned or adaptive immune response? Is it the eosinophils, basophils, B lymphocytes, or the neutrophils? And it ends up being the B lymphocytes. So what we find here then is that vaccination introduces antigens, causing your body to create antibodies and fight off these antigens. B lymphocytes create those antibodies, which then can attach to certain antigens. However, these B lymphocytes are going to be produced upon exposure to a particular antigen. So the rationale for vaccination then is you want to receive a vaccine to prime your immune system to be able to fight off certain antigens by producing the appropriate B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, against that antigen. Now, eosinophils, basophils are part of your allergic or immune response, and the neutrophils work to fight off infection directly. These are part of your innate immune response, whereas your B lymphocytes are part of your adaptive immune response. So in terms of leukocyte development, we talked about how the myeloid and lymphoid stem cell lines give rise to different cell types. If you remember that the myeloid stem cell line gives rise to most of your blood cells, like most of your leukocytes, like the granulocytes, as well as your monocytes, come from the myeloid stem cell line. But they can also give rise to other non-leukocyte blood cells, like red blood cells and platelets. Now, the lymphoid stem cell line gives rise to your lymphocytes. Remember, the lymphocytes include things like your plasma B cells, your T cells, which you have CD4 and CD8, as well as your natural killer cells. So which type of leukocyte is created in the bone marrow, or myeloid? Is it eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, or all of the above? It ends up being all of the above. So we find that the granular leukocytes are created in bone marrow, and eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, they're all granular leukocytes. And so that makes sense. Now what we find too is that some other types of immune cells can be created elsewhere, like lymph nodes. So if you all remember, lymph nodes are found in high concentration in the cervical, the axillary, inguinal, and sort of abdominal regions, as well as some other select locations. But the structure of a typical lymph node is that it has this outer capsule, and within this capsule, what you find then is a cortex and a medulla. In the cortex of the lymph node, you find a lot of germinal centers, which are shown in purple. And these germinal centers contain basically proliferating B cells. And then near these germinal centers, you can find high concentrations of T cells. And this is significant because if your lymphatic system picks up certain antigens from a tissue, can carry those antigens towards a lymph node, where those can be exposed to B cells and T cells. And then what's really cool too is that if that antigen is something that your body's encountered before, then you can have the appropriate B cells that can proliferate and basically divide, and you're going to produce a lot of B cells to help fight off that particular antigen. And your T cells are also going to be nearby, which are an important sort of activator of your immune system, especially the CD4 cells, which release cytokines. Now, in terms of white blood cell count, we talked about how the count can vary between different species, but the abundance is pretty common amongst humans. And so the most abundant are the neutrophils, then it goes the lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and then the least abundant are the basophils. Now, this is important to know because if you see more or less of a particular cell type, this can indicate problems or infection. And so just because someone has more neutrophils doesn't mean they have, a cancer of the neutrophil stem cell line. In fact, what you find then is kind of interesting is that for people who live in dense populations, they have more neutrophils. And for people who've had more sexual partners over their lifetime, they have more eosinophils. And you might wonder, why is this? So what can infer about these populations? If you live in a dense area where there's a lot more people, why do you have more neutrophils? Well, the hypothesis here is that if you're exposed to a lot more individuals, you're probably going to be around more transmissible diseases, viruses and bacteria. And so you're going to produce more neutrophils because you're exposed to more infectious organisms. And then the whole rationale behind how sexual partner count can correlate with eosinophil count is that, remember, the eosinophils are involved with helping to fight off parasitic infections. So if you've had more sexual partners, you have a greater chance of being exposed to, sexually transmitted parasites. We think of things like, bacterial infections like gonorrhea and syphilis. That's going to increase your eosinophil count over time. Now, in terms of blood cell deficiencies, we have some different terminology here, like leukopenia. Penia just means a decreased number of. So if you have leukopenia, then you're talking about having a lower count of leukocytes or white blood cells. Specifically, neutropenia refers to a decrease in the neutrophil cell count. We also have aplastic anemia, and this is actually going to be where you have a decrease in total red blood cell count within your blood. And then infectious mononucleosis is also associated with blood cell deficiencies. Mono can be caused by a variety of things. It can be caused by Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, and this in itself can also decrease populations of different leukocytes in your blood. And then HIV specifically targets CD4 positive cells, things like your CD4 positive T cells. Your T cell count is going to be lower if you have a HIV infection. Now, the first type of cancer of the blood we're going to talk about are the myeloid neoplasms. Now, the myeloid neoplasms, remember, neoplasm just means new growth. And so what we find in here is that with a mutation of the myeloid stem cell line, this can lead to the overproduction of any cell type that comes from your myeloid stem cell line. Remember, pretty much all of your granulocytes and monocytes come from the myeloid stem cell line, but you also find that red blood cells and platelets come from the myeloid stem cell line. So neoplasm of the myeloid line could lead to an overproduction of your granular cytes, as well as your monocytes, red blood cells, and platelets. Now, these replace normal bone marrow cells, and what you find is that these neoplastic cells are typically abnormal in appearance, and this is how you can identify them, is that they won't look normal. And they also, even though they have a higher count, they can sometimes be less functional or non-functional. So you might have more neutrophils, but those neutrophils might not even be functioning properly because of the fact that they're neoplastic and they're not healthy cells, they're just cancer cells. Now, there's different types of leukemia. And remember, leukemias can result from these myeloid stem cell lines. We have acute versus chronic. And so acute would just be essentially, a sort of a rapid onset of neoplastic cells from the myeloid line. And then chronic leukemia would be sort of a long-term, if we're saying greater than 6 months of production of these types of neoplastic cells. Now, for the lymphoid stem cell line, that makes the lymphoid neoplasms. If you remember from previous slides, we saw that the lymphoid stem cell line can give rise to all your lymphocytes, so your B cells, your T cells, and your natural killer cells. Again, it leads to the overproduction of abnormal immune cells, and you can get things like lymphocytic B and T cell leukemias, or Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin lymphomas, which are, again, neoplasms of B and T cells. Okay, so the first set of disorders we're going to talk about are the leukemias. So leukemias are malignant neoplasms of hematopoietic stem cells that remain within blood or bone marrow, and that's how they're defined as leukemia. Now, although leukemias mostly are related to basically cells of the myeloid stem cell line, we do find that they also involve lymphocytic stem cells. And we can subdivide these into acute versus chronic, lymphocytic and myelocytic leukemias. Remember, if they're the lymphocytic leukemias, we're talking about how they're basically cells of the lymphoid stem cell line, but they're considered leukemias if they stay within blood or bone marrow. Now, the myelocytic leukemias involve, the myeloid stem cell line, and they're still considered leukemias if they stay within blood and bone marrow. Now, what's interesting, though, is you can also have a biphenotypic leukemia, which involves either stem cell line. So, you can have lymphocytic and myelocytic leukemias at the same time. Now, one of the most commonly studied leukemias is actually related to something called Philadelphia chromosome. And this is an interesting phenomenon where chromosome 9 and chromosome 22 participate in a translocation. And remember, translocation is when you have swapping of gene segments between different chromosomes. And so what happens is that this portion of the long arm of chromosome 9 can translocate with this portion of the long arm of chromosome 22. And so what ends up happening is that this gene for ABL protein, it ends up being a proto-oncogene, when it's still on chromosome 9. But once it's translocated to this BCR locus on chromosome 22, that ends up being the genetic change, right, or the genotypic change that can lead to the phenotype, which is, myelogenous leukemia. And what ends up happening too is that essentially we get this BCR-ABL hybrid gene from this translocation that leads to the overproduction of something called ABL protein. Now we have the oncogene, right, which leads to this ABL protein. Now ABL protein is this protein that's involved with overproduction of cells of the myeloid origin. And it essentially speeds up the cell cycle. That's why these cells can be overproduced. And this ABL protein itself is the causative agent of this type of leukemia, and it's the myelogenous leukemia. Now, this question says, what's the difference between acute versus chronic leukemia? Well, acute leukemia is going to be kind of more rapid and stormy onset. Chronic is going to be, maybe less severe, more long-term, so we're saying more greater than 6 months. And what's interesting, though, is that in both conditions, we see suppression of marrow function. And it's kind of this odd paradox where, yes, you have the overproduction of marrow cells, which can end up in the blood, but these overproduced cells aren't normal or healthy, and they're typically non-functioning. And what's interesting here, then, is that these overproduced cells actually start to inhibit normal marrow function around them. And so that as a result, you see bone marrow suppression from the overproduction of bone marrow. And so then we see that, you see a lower red blood cell count, you're going to see lower leukocyte count all across the board, as well as a decrease in platelet count as well. Now, if they're lymphocytic versus myelogenous, we're saying that, lymphocytic leukemia would involve stem cells of the lymphocyte origin, right, or the lymphoid stem cell line. And if they're myelogenous, then we're saying that it's going to involve cells of the myeloid stem cell line. So what's interesting is that leukemia affects bone marrow activity. And so the question then is that, how can leukemia put you at risk for things like bone pain and fracture? Well, the bone pain could come from the overproduction of cells within the bone itself, putting internal stress on the bone, leading to pain. It can also put you at risk for fractures from, first of all, malnutrition and sort of a decrease in circulating nutrients, but also those internal stresses within the bone can weaken the bone over time and also increase the risk for fracture. Leukemias can put you at risk for anemia, because those proliferating cells actually suppress normal marrow function, leading to things like, basically aplastic anemia, where you actually can't produce new red blood cells as well. It can also lead to thrombocytopenia, where you have a suppression of the megakaryocytes. So you get an underproduction of platelets, which are the thrombocytes, and that can lead to thrombocytopenia. So you get things like bleeding disorders. And just generally, immune suppression can result as well, because these rapidly dividing marrow cells, which are non-functional, can also lead to the underproduction of leukocytes. So it's this sort of, like I said, odd paradox where, due to an overproduction of marrow, you can get suppression of your immune system. But remember, this overproduced marrow is actually non-functional. So, scenario here, we have abnormal white blood cells are produced. And as a result, they can release inflammatory mediators. They can infiltrate peripheral lymphoid organs, increase blood viscosity, and lead to production of waste products. So if you think about the signs and symptoms that normally result from leukemias or lymphomas, which signs and symptoms would correlate with the release of inflammatory mediators? Well, if you guys remember, we said that inflammatory mediators are associated with things like fever and sweating. And you're going to see that with leukemias. We also talked about how leukemias and lymphomas, if they proliferate in peripheral tissues, it can lead to swelling within those tissues. So if we're talking about a leukemia, we're going to see swelling within peripheral organs like the spleen or the liver. or even bone. It can increase blood viscosity, and remember, blood that's more viscous is harder to pump, so you can have an increase in blood pressure. It can put you at risk for blood clots, which can lead to things like thrombi and emboli. And then these cells also create waste products, so it's going to put excess stress on your liver and kidneys. So a child develops night sweats and nosebleeds. He appears pale, weak, and fatigued. Cervical lymph nodes are enlarged. Blast count is elevated. And after chemotherapy, he develops hyperkalemia. And this question says, why did this happen? Well, the paleness and the weakness and the fatigue come from the neoplasm itself, right? We said that neoplasms, as they're proliferating, they can really draw in a lot of nutrients, which can take away nutrients from other cells, leading to things like fatigue and weakness. The paleness or pallor can result from anemia, and we said that anemia is one of the side effects of leukemias as well, because of the underproduction of red blood cells from aplastic anemia. Cervical lymph nodes can become enlarged as well if these cells start to invade the lymphoid tissue and then proliferate. It also could happen as a result of immune cell activation, where your normal healthy immune cells can recognize the neoplastic cells, and they can mount an immune response, which then can lead to enlargement of lymph nodes. We see that blast count is elevated, but this could actually be due to the neoplasm itself. And what's weird then with leukemias is you're going to see blast cells within circulating tissue like blood, which isn't normal. You should normally find blast cells within marrow, not blood. So it's weird to think that you can find stem cells within blood, but that's characteristic of leukemias. And then this is the kind of the most interesting part to me is that after chemotherapy, right, where these drugs have actually started now to inhibit cell proliferation, and these cells actually start to die, this child develops hyperkalemia. Now this makes sense because cells have a higher concentration of potassium in the intracellular fluid than the extracellular fluid. So if these chemotherapeutic agents start to cause lysis of neoplastic cells and then liberate potassium from their intracellular fluid into the extracellular fluid of the body, this can lead to hyperkalemia because now you're just basically spilling out potassium into the bloodstream. Now, we talked about how hyperkalemia can actually lead to an increase in neuromuscular excitability, and that can lead to things like arrhythmias or even heart block, as well as cramping of muscles. Now, chemotherapeutic agents also particularly put a lot of stress on your kidneys, which makes it extra difficult to get rid of that excess potassium as well. Now, for the lymphomas, these are the types of neoplasms that affect, lymphocytes. So we said that it's going to affect B cells and T cells. Now, lymphomas are circulating tumors of the lymphatic systems. You're going to find that these are going to spread throughout areas like your lymph nodes and your spleen and other lymphoid tissues, including the tonsils. Now, we have Hodgkin versus non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin lymphomas include the B cells and T cells. And then Hodgkin's lymphomas involve these B cells, which invade lymphoid organs. And those are going to be associated with the Reed-Sternberg cells, which are these abnormally looking B cells. Now, true or false, Hodgkin lymphoma has better prognosis than non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Well, it ends up being true, and the reason being is that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma originates from malignancies of both T and B lymphocytes, whereas the Hodgkin malignancies originate from B cells, and we get these Reed-Sternberg cells. Now, these Reed-Sternberg cells are only going to be associated with the B cells, and so because of the fact that non-Hodgkin lymphomas affect T and B cells, we're going to see more immune function lost with the non-Hodgkin lymphoma versus the Hodgkin, and so the prognosis isn't as good with non-Hodgkin lymphoma because they're going to potentially be at risk of infection because of the fact that it's going to affect both T and B cells. Whereas, remember, Hodgkin's lymphoma only affects the B cells, and they create a special type of cell called the Reed-Sternberg cell. And this is how it's characterized. Under tissue biopsy, you actually can see Reed-Sternberg cells. Now, for the lymphomas, we talked about how they can be due to abnormal B cells, which can form tumors, and these B cell tumors can spread throughout the lymphatic system and invade lymph nodes, which can lead to lymphadenopathy or swelling of lymph nodes. so they can become swollen and tender. Now, they can also produce abnormal antibodies, which can lead to immune depression. Proteins can increase blood viscosity, which can also put you at risk for blood clots. And they can infiltrate different organs, especially ones which have lymphoid tissue, like your digestive tract and spleen. Now, some of these can also lead to the proliferation of osteoclasts, and these osteoclastomas, also called giant cell tumors, can break down bone and lead to weakening of bone.